Senator from Jefferson, 19.
Speak on the bill, Mr. President.
Please proceed.
Thank you. We've heard just a little bit now about voter fraud. I think it's important to distinguish what we're talking about. There is voter fraud. There can be voter fraud, whether it's from vote buying or vote hauling, and there's well-documented history of that. That's not what we're talking about today. And this bill has nothing to do with that type of voter fraud. In fact, the sponsor of the bill here on the floor and the Secretary of State yesterday in committee said this bill only addresses in-person voting fraud. That's all this bill is targeted towards, in-person voting fraud. Well, here's a fun trivia fact for everybody to use this week when they go out. Guess how many instances of in-person voting fraud we have in Kentucky? 0. Don't take my word for it, take the Republican Secretary of State's word for it. When he testified in committee, we have 0 instances of in-person voter fraud. The sponsor of the bill here on the floor today said he is unaware of any instances of in-person voting fraud. But what the senator from Scott just alluded to and what the Secretary of State said explicitly yesterday was, but you know what we need to do? Even though this has never happened, government needs to get out in front of the problem. Okay. 22% of Kentucky's kids are living in poverty. But we're not advancing any legislation to discuss raising our minimum wage to a living wage. 477 Kentuckians killed themselves with a firearm last year. We're not discussing an extreme risk protection order that would have saved their lives. 1 million Kentuckians are pre-diabetic. Many died last year because they couldn't afford their insulin. But we haven't passed a bill to go towards that life-saving drug and reducing its cost. There are 0 instances of voter fraud. So why are we talking about it? That's the only thing this bill allows to prevent it. Well, we've heard a second explanation now. To increase the public's confidence in our election. How is the public not confident when it's never happened? But okay, let's talk about it. You know why there are 0 instances of voter fraud, in-person voter fraud in Kentucky? Because we already have laws on the books that require you to identify yourself when you vote. This is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. We all want our elections to be free from interference, and we want the most number of people to be involved possible. That's why we have a law on the books that requires you to identify yourself when you vote. We have 0 instances of in-person voter fraud with the law we have now. Government has been proactive on this front, and it's working. In fact, the Secretary of State testified yesterday in committee that 98% of Kentuckians already use a driver's license to vote. So we're here on Senate Bill 2, a priority bill of the State Senate, because of 2% of people that don't have a government-issued ID for a topic in which we have 0 instances of in-person voting fraud. And it's those 2% that I'm worried about. Those are the 2% who are often poor, who can't afford those licenses, who have circumstances that don't allow them the form of government ID we're talking about. Their voices are who I'm amplifying today. Because you know what? This is really simple. If you want more people to do something, you make it easier. If you want fewer people to do something, you make it harder. We are making it harder with this bill for those people to vote. And that's not what we should be doing. Now, the bill has done some good things. And it said we're going to give a free government ID to anyone who wants one. Okay, I would remind this body, even though there's no fiscal note attached, it's not free. In North Carolina, they spent $20 million to give out free IDs with their voter ID law. In Indiana, they spent $10 million. I can think of $10 million we could better spend in Kentucky when we have 0 instances of in-person voter fraud today. I want to address one more thing. We've heard about personal responsibility. We are talking about people who, even though they might not have enough or have the means to get a driver's license are taking the personal responsibility to walk themselves or take a bus to their polling station to have their voice heard in our elections. That is personal responsibility, and it's not personal responsibility we should discourage with this bill.
Senator from Green, would you assume the chair?